They left her to die, but the jungle had other plans. The shadows moved first. Then came the silence so deep it pressed against her bones. She was just a child, pale violet skin, torn clothes, too small to fight, too lost to be found. And yet, the monsters came anyway. Left beneath the twisted roots of a broken tree, she had no map, no food, no voice left to scream. Her name was She. In a jungle where every sound meant death, every breath was borrowed. Until something else fell from the sky. Not another beast. Not a rescue team. But a human ant. He didn't run. When he lifted her into his arms, the monsters should have backed away. But they didn't. They chased. And when they cornered her, when her protector's weapon clicked empty, she raised her hand, and the light erupted from her skin. What came next wasn't survival. It was war. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about monsters in the dark. It's about what happens when light chooses the one left behind. And when a soldier finds not a child, but hope. The jungle breathed like a wounded bee sweat, hot, alive. Trees groaned beneath their own twisted weight, ancient and swollen with secrets. Vines dangled low from the canopy, twitching with every gust of wind, like they were listening, like they knew. Shadows didn't just fall here, they watched. And in the belly of it all, half buried beneath the roots of a fallen tree, a child tried to vanish. She didn't belong to this world. Her skin held the soft hue of twilight pale violet, streaked with dust and dried blood. Her knees were scraped, her fingers raw, her breath shallow and quiet, like she was scared the air might betray her. Her name was She. The jungle didn't care. It whispered threats in a language older than fire. The trees above swayed like titans in slow motion. Everything moved. Nothing was safe. She's clothes hung from her like torn leaves. Her legs twitched with each passing tremor in the earth, and on her wrist cold against her skin was a smooth band of metal blinking red, slower each time. A tracker. Almost dead. Almost useless. Almost like her. She had no food, no tools, no voice left to scream. No one. Only the memory of running, fire, metal tearing the sky apart. The crash. The smoke. Her people scattering through the green like sparks in the wind. And then nothing. No one came back. Not for her, not ever. So, she curled tighter beneath the roots, pressing herself into the damp soil like she could dissolve into the jungle itself. If she stayed still enough, maybe the monsters wouldn't see her. But the jungle saw everything. Far off, deep enough to feel, and not just hear a roar split the silence. Not a beast, not a storm, something worse. It screeched like steel being torn apart by rage. A sound that didn't belong to any living thing. She's eyes snapped open. Her heart dropped like a stone in her chest. And though her legs ached and her feet were cut and raw, she ran. She didn't know where. She didn't look back. She only knew the sound had come for her. The jungle didn't let go gently. It clawed at her as she ran, branches slicing across her arms, thorns tugging at her legs. Mud sucked at her feet like hands from beneath the earth, but she kept running, heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted out. She wasn't fast, she wasn't strong, but fear moved her. Then the ground betrayed her. Her foot caught on a root, hidden beneath a mat of leaves. The world flipped. Her body slammed into the cold, wet soil, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And that's when she saw it. Through the reeds and broken grass ahead, something emerged. Massive. A creature out of nightmares, its body wrapped in black, jagged armor that looked like it had been carved from volcanic stone. 4 legs that didn't move like any animal she knew, and a long, serpentine head with rows of glistening teeth. It sniffed once. The sound alone vibrated the dirt. Then it turned. Eyes burning, red, unblinking, locked onto her. She's heart stuttered. She couldn't cry, couldn't run. The fear wasn't just in her chest now, it was in her bones. Time stopped. Then, a crack of light. No roar, no warning. Just a searing explosion that tore through the trees and slammed into the beast's side. The creature screamed, metal and rage in one sound, its body flung sideways into the jungle. Smoke rolled through the clearing. Something moved inside it, a shape. Boots hit the ground, first heavy, deliberate. Then a figure emerged from the haze, holding something long and deadly that still smoked at the barrel. Not a beast, not alien. Human. His armor was scratched and scorched, streaked with dirt and ash. His face hardened but not cruel. Pale skin, eyes that didn't glow, eyes that saw. She gasped. She tried to crawl backward, but her leg wouldn't move. Blood ran warm down her calf. She whimpered. The man didn't speak. He didn't shout or grab. He just knelt, quiet. He placed the weapon beside him, slow, like he wanted her to see. Then raised both hands in the air, palms open, empty. No threat, no rush. She didn't understand the language of his mouth, but she understood the language of stillness. He waited, and she nodded. Barely, but enough. He scooped her into his arms like she was something fragile, something important. His armor was cold, but his arms were not. They were steady, alive. And in that single moment, wrapped in the arms of a stranger from the stars, she felt something she hadn't known in days. Not safety, not yet. But the beginning of it. Night settled over the jungle like a heavy cloak, smothering the last breath of daylight. Somewhere deep in its lungs, a single flicker of firelight danced low in a hollow clearing, small but defiant. The flames hissed softly, licking the edges of damp wood, casting shadows that wavered like spirits on the bark of the trees. She lay beside the fire, cocooned in a strange, heavy cloth tube, big for her, but warm. Her leg was bound tight with something clean, something that didn't sting. The pain had dulled. Her body no longer shook, not from fear, not yet from comfort either, but from something new, something in between. A few steps away, the human sat with his back to her, silent. The firelight caught the side of his face, tired, marked with soot and scratches. Steam curled from his fingers as he rinsed them in a battered metal cup. His weapon rested at his side, always close, never forgotten. He hadn't left her. Not once. She stirred, her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the glow. She flinched out of habit, expecting pain, expecting fear. But all he did was lift one hand, palm up, still, open, as if saying, "You're safe, still safe." He reached into his gear and pulled out a small silver packet. Carefully, he opened it and placed something square and dry on a flat rock near her, then stepped back again. No words. No motion beyond what was necessary. Just patience. Her stomach answered before she did. A low, pitiful growl. She hesitated, then crawled toward the offering. The food was strange, smoky, salty. It crunched too loud in her mouth. But it was good. She chewed in silence, firelight warming one side of her face, cold jungle pressing on the other. And still he watched her, not like a soldier, not like a scientist, like a guardian. She looked up, her throat tight, eyes wet. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed, but he didn't react. He just watched and waited. After a while, her voice came back to her, small, raw, almost too soft to hear. She placed one hand gently over her chest. "See." The name trembled in the air like a leaf ready to fall. The man's face shifted, not surprised, not confused, just listening. He nodded once, then mirrored her motion. One hand over his own chest. Grant. The name felt round, solid, heavy in a way hers didn't. She tried it again under her breath. Grunt. A flicker of a smile pulled at his mouth. Not wide, but real. And in the hush of the jungle, with monsters somewhere out there in the dark, she and Grant sat together in silence. Two names, two worlds. And maybe for the first time, one beginning, the jungle did not sleep. Its voice was quieter now, but heavier like breath held in a throat before the scream. Wind pressed through the leaves with a hiss, but beneath that sound, there was something else. A growl. Faint. Low. Wrong. She stirred beneath the blanket, her fingers curled into the fabric, eyes wide open, listening. Grant was already on his feet. No rush, no panic. He moved like someone who had done this before. His weapon slid into his hands, quiet as breath. He stepped forward, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the dark beyond the firelight. Then, silence. And then movement. Something shifted between the trees, gliding instead of walking. Its form rippled like smoke, given flesh too thin, too long. Its skin gleamed like black bone, stretched over a shape that didn't match anything natural. And its eyes, blood red, watching, calculating. She gasped, the sound catching in her throat. The creature snapped its head toward her. Grant fired. A single shot cracked the air sharp and final. The blast lit up the clearing for half a second, enough to see the creature's skull snap backward, then crash into the leaves. It didn't scream. It just fell. Dead. She's breath came in trembles. Her body refused to move. Her voice was somewhere far away. Grant walked forward, checked the thing's body, then gripped it by one twisted limb and dragged it into the trees without a word. When he returned, he didn't speak, didn't ask if she was okay. He simply sat beside her, opened another silver packet, and handed it over. Her hands shook as she took it. She stared down at the dry, strange food and whispered a single word. Monster. Grant's voice was low, even. Yes. That was all. No comfort, no promises. Just truth. And somehow, it was enough. She leaned into his side not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew he wasn't. Not yet, not ever. The jungle continued to scream in the distance. The trees bent with winds that smelled like old blood and smoke. But she didn't dream of claws or teeth anymore. That night, in the shadow of monsters, she dreamed of light. The wind shifted first sharp, sudden, and cold like breath from a dead god. Then came the sky. Clouds rolled in fast, like bruises spreading across heaven's skin. Lightning cracked without warning, illuminating the jungle for a heartbeat before plunging everything back into a darker black than night itself. Grant moved without hesitation. He lifted she into his arms, holding her close to his chest. Her small hands gripped the folds of his armor. Rain came next thick and punishing, like falling needles, and behind them, things followed. Not footsteps, not voices. Shapes, too smooth, too fast, moving through the trees without sound but leaving fear behind. The storm didn't wait, neither did Grant. Through mud, through roots, through wild coils of jungle, he ran until a massive, twisted tree appeared, its trunk split wide, like a wound in the earth, its heart hollow. Shelter. Temporary but dry. He stepped inside and laid she down gently on a bed of soft roots, then turned his back to her and crouched at the opening, weapon raised, scanning the dark. She sat up slowly, still wrapped in his cloak. Her voice was barely more than breath. Why? She whispered. Why help me? Grant didn't look back. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, quietly, one word. Alone. She crawled closer. The question wasn't finished. You too? He didn't answer. But she saw it in the way his shoulders shifted, the way his head dipped just slightly. He didn't have to speak. She already knew. Then the world tore open again. A screech. No, a roar ripped from a throat too deep, too wide. Wood exploded beside her. A jagged claw burst through the bark, inches from she's face. She screamed. Grant turned, fired click. Empty. The monster shoved its way inside. Tall as the tree, skin wet and gleaming like stone soaked in oil. Teeth endless, red eyes hungry. It lunged. She threw up her hand without thinking. And the mark on her wrist lit up. Not a glow, not a shimmer. A pulse. A wave of pure blue light erupted from her body, hitting the monster square in its face. The beast was lifted from the ground, launched backward through the opening, its body crashing through the trees like a meteor of bone and muscle. Silence crashed down behind it. Rain still fell, but the jungle was suddenly breathless. She stared at her hand, still trembling, her chest rising and falling in broken rhythm. What was that? She whispered. Grant turned, slowly stepping toward her. His voice was low, calm, and laced with something she hadn't heard before: curiosity. Not normal. But his eyes weren't afraid. They were watching her like she'd just become something more. The rain did not stop it, pressed against them like a second skin, soaking everything, chilling the bones. Thunder crawled overhead, distant but constant, like a warning with no language. The jungle had gone quiet. Too quiet. Grant didn't speak. She clung to his neck, her arms tight, her face buried in the curve of his shoulder. Each step he took left behind the shape of a man refusing to fall. They reached the edge of the world. A cliff loomed out of the trees like the spine of the planet, jagged and gray, slick with moss and time. At its base a wound, a crack in the rock, wide enough to enter, dark enough to vanish. He ducked inside with her in his arms. Silence. No wind, no rain. Just the sound of dripping stone and the soft pad of boots on dry ground. The cave swallowed them whole. Then she saw it. Bones. They lay scattered in the corners like forgotten prayers, some long and twisted, others small and cracked. Human skulls still inside cracked helmets. Alien armor warped by heat. Weapons half melted. As if whatever came here hadn't just killed it erased. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, trembling. People died here. Grant looked down at a nearby skeleton. His hand moved gently, brushing away dust from what remained of a nameplate. His voice was quiet. They tried to hide, like us. He found a datapad buried under a collapsed pack. The screen flickered, half dead, blinking in the dark like a last heartbeat. He tapped it. Static. Then a voice broke through. If you find this, the child is the key. The light is not a curse. It is our only hope. The cave seemed to freeze in place. She stared at the device, then at her hand. It was glowing again. Soft, blue, steady. She lifted her wrist into the faint firelight, and the light answered back, not wild this time, not out of fear. It pulsed like it belonged. She looked up, voice trembling. I'm not cursed. Grant watched her. He didn't speak right away, just nodded. No, he said. You were never cursed. He took a breath. You were chosen. And this time, she believed it. Silence hung thick as stone. Even the cave seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound. Dull, rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. Not thunder, not footsteps. Something heavier. Something hunting. Grant stood without a word. He didn't need to tell her Exie was already moving, backing into the shadows. Her mark glowed faint on her wrist, but her eyes were fixed forward. The first shape stepped into view. Massive. Its body moved like armor fused with bone. The air bent around it, like even the atmosphere was afraid. Behind it, smaller ones, quicker, meaner, glowing red eyes slicing through the dark. Grant raised his weapon. Stay behind me. Number, her voice didn't shake. I want to help. He looked at her, not like a child, not like a victim. Just her. He gave a single nod. Then stand with me. The beasts charged. The ground trembled. Grant fired on 2, 3 flashes. The shots lit the cave like lightning. One of the creatures jerked mid-run, thrown sideways into a wall of stone. It didn't get back up. The second leapt fast, teeth bared. He fired again. Missed. Claws scraped metal. She screamed as the thing flew past her, but her scream turned into something elsey. Blast of raw power erupted upward, slamming into the ceiling. Rock split. The creature was buried under a rain of jagged stone, crushed before it could roar. But the largest remained. It didn't charge. It walked. Deliberate, confident, a predator that had seen too many battles and survived them all. Grant turned but too slow. The beast slammed into him, sent him flying. His body crashed against the cave wall and dropped hard. He didn't get up. She's light flickered. Weak. Too weak. The monster turned to her now. It moved with hunger, purpose. She stepped back. Her legs felt hollow, her breath too fast. The glow on her wrist dimmed. The monster lunged. Then, bang, a final shot, straight between the eyes. The beast dropped in midair, one last twitch, then stillness. Real silence followed, not the silence of hiding, the silence of survival. She stood frozen, her hands still raised, her heart still racing. Then she dropped to her knees beside him. Grant's eyes opened, and he smiled. She knelt beside him, her small hands trembling as they found his arm. Blood smeared his armor, dust clung to his face, but he was breathing, eyes open, still here. She helped him sit against the cold wall, one arm around his back, steadying him as if her tiny frame could carry the weight he held inside. You okay? She whispered. Grant exhaled, wincing. Hurt, he said, but alive. She didn't move away. Her fingers brushed against his. You stayed, she murmured, when everyone else ran. The fire in the cave crackled low, casting slow-moving shadows across his tired face. His eyes found hers, and for a moment, something behind them broke open. I had a daughter, he said quietly. The words barely made it into the air. She's gone. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask how or why. She just reached for his hand and wrapped hers around it. No words, just warmth. You're not alone now, she said, voice softer than silence. His lips curled just enough to be called a smile. Tired, honest. Neither are you. And for a little while, they sat like that. Two survivors, two losses, two lights that had not gone out. No longer strangers. No longer alone. The clouds parted. Not from storm, but from fire. Two ships broke through the skylong, silver, cutting the clouds with burning engines. Their lights blinked across the canopy like stars falling too slow. Rescue. Salvation. She stood at the mouth of the cave, her cloak clinging to her shoulders, her small frame lit faintly by the glow on her wrist. Beside her, Grant stood tall, wounded but upright, his arm still wrapped in bandages, his blade strapped beneath his rifle. They didn't smile. Not yet. Because the jungle moved again. The silence broke. And from the trees they came. Not one, not three. Dozens. The ground shook beneath their weight. Screams rose like sirens made of hunger and rage. Claws slammed into the dirt. Red eyes burned through the smoke. Grant lifted his weapon. No more running. She's eyes didn't waver. She raised both hands. We finish it. Her light kimono wild like before. Not trembling, not afraid. It surged from her palms in a steady wave, controlled, focused, like a river of blue fire pouring straight from her will. The air around her shimmered. Grant moved beside her. He fired, repositioned, drew his blade when the gun grew too hot. She advanced. Each step forward pushed back the dark. The jungle itself seemed to recoil. Trees bent, beasts staggered. She didn't scream. She didn't blink. She pushed through. One by one, the creatures slowed. Their snarls gave way to uncertainty, then to hesitation, then to fear. And then the sky exploded again. The rescue ships descended in full, engines roaring across the treetops. Searchlights pierced through the mist. Doors slammed open. Troops human and alien poured out in armor and fire, weapons ready. But there was nothing left to fight. The clearing was quiet. Bodies lay still. And at the center, two silhouettes stood. One small, glowing. One tall, bleeding. But both unbroken. She lowered her hands. Her wrists still pulsed with light, but it was no longer trying to protect her. It was part of her now. She looked at Grant. The battle was over. But something bigger had just begun. The hum of the rescue ship was soft, like a lullaby sung by metal and stars. She sat beside Grant on a padded bench, wrapped once more in his old cloak. The air was warm now, sterile, safe, but her wrist still glowed quiet and steady, like it was breathing with her. Across from her, Grant rested with his arm in a sling, the cuts on his face stitched and cleaned. The exhaustion hadn't left him, but the pain had softened. For the first time in days, he looked human again. Where will I go now? She asked, her voice barely louder than the hum beneath her feet. He looked at her, not with answers, just truth. Don't go alone. She thought about that, then nodded. Okay, friend. She lifted her little finger, uncertain, hopeful. He paused, then smiled faintly, remembering, and he linked his pinky with hers. Promise. The ship lifted off, smooth as breath. Jungle faded below. Rainforest became canopy. Canopy became clouds. Clouds became sky. They didn't cry. They didn't wave. They simply watched the world shrink beneath them. They had not crawled out of the jungle. They had risen. Two survivors. One light. And whatever came next, they would walk into it. Together. She was just a child left to die among monsters, forgotten in a jungle that devoured the weak. But she didn't disappear. She lit up the dark. And when the monsters came, it wasn't the rescue ships that saved her. It wasn't the soldiers. It was her. With trembling hands, she turned fear into fire. And with a wounded soldier by her side, she became more than a survivor. She became a symbol. A girl once abandoned, now the reason others lived. They didn't escape that jungle. They conquered it. And when they rose into the sky, side by side, they left behind more than bones and blood. They left behind a warning. If you ever return to that jungle, don't look for the monsters. Look for the two who walked out together. Because sometimes the universe doesn't send heroes. It sends each other. And if this story moved you, you haven't seen the last of what Alien Chronicles has to reveal. Subscribe. Because the next story may be the one that changes everything.